If you want to know what to build on every single champion, today we're going to go over what the best items are for each champion, starting from 1 cost all the way to 5, and we'll also be going over why. It's always important to understand why, just in case a patch happens, and then maybe you'll start realizing, oh, maybe that's why they switched up the item build here and there. So I'm just going to get right into it. Starting at 1 cost, I have the tanks in the top left, the melee carries top right, AP bottom right, and range attack damage bottom left. So we'll just start on the top left. I also note which units may be good for carrying like utility items or maybe stuff you just shouldn't really itemize. So starting with Poppy, like she's just not that strong of a unit. She's more of a trait bot if you need gadgetines or more defenders. So generally you just build stuff like Zezrot Portal on her, maybe like a Shroud of Stillness. You don't really want to have her as your main tank. A lot of important things to consider with 1 cost units is that they can't really be your main tank. They could be like a secondary tank, or they could work in a reroll comp, but Poppy doesn't really have those complementing her. Next up is Blitzcrank. Similar to Poppy, but Blitzcrank, he has a naturally built-in damage reduction in his ability. I believe it's around 15%, and since that's the case, he already has a lot of built-in natural scaling. So to complement that, you just stack health such as Warmogs and Redemption to really make more use of that ability. Nasus is rerollable, especially if you get the stacks on stacks augment for him. He's going to want RFC to stay safe, Bloodthirster to heal up a bit, and then Titan's Resolve just because he's going to be a melee carry. I know he has the range from the RFC, but he still is able to stack up the Titan's Resolve quite a bit, and he'll just hopefully be unstoppable in the early to mid game. Next up, we have Renekton. I've seen some Renekton rerolls work as the main tank with like Ashe as the main DPS in the backline. And he is going to be pretty good with health items because he scales off of health. So Warmog's definitely going to be a go-to. And then to complement the Warmogs, Redemption and Dragonclaw just gives him a ton of healing based on his percent health. So that's what you'd want there. Next up we have is Sylas. So Sylas also scales off of health really well. So we're going to stack the double Warmogs on him with the Redemption. Of course, you don't need like double Warmogs. It's just, if I could pick items out of a hat, that's what I would put on him. That's how I kind of make this. So maybe in that game, you don't have that many belts. You could build stuff like Protector's Vow. You could build stuff like Dragonclaw like we see here, Gargoyle Stoneplate, Bramble Vest. Literally any tank item will do on these guys. Galio is the next one. So he's a bit of a unique case. He gives your team mana because he's a civilian. So what that means is for Galio, you're generally going to be playing ability power compositions because ability power compositions really like mana regeneration from civilians. So if you do run a Galio and you need to like throw some items on him, maybe he's 3-starred for some random reason, I would go for an Ionic Spark or like other utility items. Now onto the melee carries. So that's going to be Gangplank, Wukong, and Talon. Starting with Gangplank, there are a lot of Gangplank rerolls available. We have like a guide on all the comps and how they rank in the current set on my website, bunnymuffins.lol/meta. So you could just look for Gangplank here. We have the Gangplank super comp. You'll see a very similar build over here. The thing is, like in a specific comp versus in an item guide, the items may differ a tiny bit based on just what type of complementary units are in that build. So that's why you may see some discrepancies between the items you list out here versus the items there. But keep in mind, unless I mention an item is completely mandatory, there's a lot of flexibility in items in TFT. And in set 8, that's one of the updates that they made sure was put in. They put more power into the actual champions and lessen the power of items a slight bit. On to the next character, we have Wukong. Wukong, he does ability power damage. He also has an ability that spins around him, and the more units he hits, the more armor and magic resistance that he gets. So he really likes stuff like Dragonclaw because you want him to kind of be like your solo tank. Ionic Spark's pretty good if you want to do some damage on him, and Titan's Resolve is pretty decent as well. Wukong can kind of do all 3 builds. He could go full damage. I've seen like Jeweled Gauntlet, Handed Justice on him. I've seen full tank with like Warmogs, Bramble Vest, Dragonclaw, things like that. But you could kind of do like a mix and match build as we see here too. A lot of different things work on Wukong. After that, we have Talon. So again, if I had to pick an item out of a hat, I like Double-Handed Justice, Jeweled Gauntlet. Because Jeweled Gauntlet allows your abilities to critically strike, Handed Justice gives a lot of critical strike now. It gives 20%. So in this build here, he gets 40% critical strike chance from Handed Justice and then 35% from Jeweled Gauntlet. This would give him 100% critical strike chance because I believe everyone has a base crit strike chance of 25%. Critical strike is one of the only stats you want to stack into if you build a little bit of it. The reason why is because there are things called multiplicative scaling versus linear scaling, and critical strike is one of those rare stats that actually benefits the more you stack it. Let's contrast that with Ashe. So Ashe, she's a recon and she's a laser core, and her ability gives her attack damage. So you can already notice the one stat she lacks is attack speed. So since we already have attack damage taken care of from her ability, we have critical strike chance taken care of from recon, all we have to focus on is her attack speed. That's why we like Rage Blade on Ashe. So there are a lot of different nuances with items such as like effective HP, scaling as we talked about before, and you really need to know which champions benefit from which. Runon's Hurricane is essentially going to accentuate her attack damage buff from her ability because it shoots an additional bolt, and it also gives her a bit of attack speed. Last Whisper is great for adding more critical strike chance to recon, and since she does purely physical damage, Last Whisper is going to do just fine. Contrast that with Kayle, she does mostly attack damage but a little bit of magic damage, so while she still benefits from Last Whisper, Kayle doesn't need to build it because she does like a tiny bit of magic damage. It's not that much, but it is something to consider, so Last Whisper would be more valuable on Ashe than on Kayle. On Kayle, you'd go for something like full damage items, so Infinity Edge, Giant Slayer, Deathblade. Why, you may ask? How does that follow the theme we were just talking about before? Well, it's pretty simple. She's a duelist, so duelist gives a lot of attack speed, and it's essentially like a built-in Guinsoo's Rage Blade. So that's why you focus more on attack damage and damage amplification on Kayle instead of things like attack speed, because she already has attack speed built in. I could show you guys the math, maybe I'll do so in a future video, but since we have to cover like 50-some champions or 60-some champions in this video, we just don't have time for that right now. On to the next characters, we finally have the AP carries. We're going to start with Lux. Her mana pool is 70, so blue buff is okay on her. You could go blue buff or Shojin. It's kind of like that break-even point where you could go for either or. I think blue buff is slightly better though because her first cast does help out a little bit. Jeweled Gauntlet and Rabadon's Death Cap going to be just the generic AP items of choice. You don't really need healing on her because she's in the back line, so that's why you don't see stuff like Handed Justice or Hextech Gunblade. Contrast that with Lulu. She's going to have the blue buff Jeweled Gauntlet and the Hextech Gunblade. The reason why I like Gunblade on Lulu more so than Lux is because I think Lulu does a little bit more damage than Lux, so it's a little bit more justifiable. And when you do more damage, healing is going to be a lot better because it heals based on the percent of damage dealt. So that's why I like having the Hextech Gunblade on Lulu over Lux. Lux kind of needs more of the damage boost, and it makes sense because Lux's ability reduces the target's attack damage by 40% for a couple of seconds, so it only makes sense that she does less damage than Lulu. Let's move on into the tier 2. So tier 2 is a bit of an awkward situation because some of the units, I don't know if you guys have noticed yet, they don't have that many items on them. And the reason why is because tier 2 is that tier where you don't really 3-star them that often. And when you do, it's more difficult to hit than the 1-cost reroll. So the 1-cost rerolls like Ashe, like if you're itemizing Ashe, she's going to be 3-star. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Because if she's 2-star or 1-star, you'd sell her and buy a different carry instead. But with 2-cost, some of these units are good trait bots and you play them in your endgame boards, but they're not necessarily going to be 3-star. So we're going to be putting a lot more supportive items on these 2-cost carries. And for the for sure reroll carries, we're going to put full items on them. But that's just one thing to keep in mind when you're comparing 2-cost versus 1-cost or 3-cost. Because 3-cost, again, those are trait synergies, but sometimes they can be good enough to carry just even as a 2-star. But of course, if you get carry augments, as we'll talk about for like Yuumi, for example, if you get carry Yuumi, you can go full damage on her, but that's a 1 out of like 118 augment. You know, I'm not gonna make an item guide off of a 1 out of 118. So starting at the top left again, we have the 2-cost tanks. Lee Sin, he's a super, so he's often gonna get to 3-star. Same with Malphite, so we'll talk about him right after. Lee Sin, I think, is the better tank between him and Malphite because he gives a shield to a direct person on your team. He also dashes back and forth, so that's why I like items like Sunfire Cape. Now, you may be wondering, like, why don't you like Malphite as a tank instead of Lee Sin? Well, again, since Lee Sin's more of a support for my main carry, I want to keep him alive longer than I want Malphite alive. Malphite's ability just gives him armor, so he's pretty good if he's like one of your main tanks, but in a reroll with Lee Sin, you're often supporting a melee carry such as Gangplank, so you'd rather put the shield on the Gangplank than have a tankier Malphite. That's why for Malphite, I like items such as like Zizirot Portal just to give him some tankiness. And of course, if you have a 2-star Lee Sin and a 3-star Malphite, then in those cases, I would itemize the Malphite instead. But all things equal, let's say they're both 2-star or they're both 3-star, I would much rather itemize Lee Sin. Let's move on to Vi next. So Vi, she's kind of in the same boat as Malphite and Rel. She's mainly used as a trait bot, and that's why I like items such as Shroud of Stillness on her. But you could put stuff like Zephyr on her too. The reason why I don't like Zezirot on Vi over Rel and Malphite though is because Vi gives a armor shred for your team, so you kind of want to keep her alive a little longer than Rel and Malphite. Rel and Malphite, their jobs is just to tank as much as possible, and they're probably going to die in the first parts of the fight. But Vi you want to keep around as long as you can so that she can keep applying her armor penetration debuff to enemy units. So that's why I don't like Zezirot on Vi, whereas I can put other support items on her, such as Shroud of Stillness, Zephyr, hell, even like a Locket if you have that, you know? So that's one of the key differences between these units. Next up, we have Annie. So Annie, she can be a main tank because often when you're doing some sort of reroll Spellslinger comp, she's going to be the main person, you know? Or like maybe you have like a Gadgettine reroll build with like Lulu. So you'll most likely get a 3-star Annie. And since you're playing ability power, I like having Ionic Spark on her because you most likely will not get to Mordekaiser for the magic resist shredding. So that's why I like having the Ionic Spark on her. And then after that, Warmogs, Gargoyle, Stoneplate, just standard good tank items on her. Pretty flexible into most teams. Obviously, if you're facing a lot of magic damage, opt for a Dragon Claw. If you're facing a lot of crit, Bramble Vest, things of that nature. If Annie is just a 2-star though, she's on Zezirot duty. After that, we have Fiora. Fiora's a bit of an interesting case. I've seen damage Fiora, I've seen tank Fiora. The build I like the most is kind of like this hybrid where it's like kind of sustainy, does like a little bit of damage with the Titan's Resolve, but mainly Fiora is just a sustain bot because she gets a damage reduction buff whenever she casts her ability, which is really powerful. So you just need to keep her alive as long as possible. The Redemption Warmogs combo is a really good combo if you guys haven't noticed that yet, because you get a lot of health from the Warmogs and then you just heal a lot based on percent missing health from your Redemption, so they just work together hand in hand. Lastly, since Fiora has a naturally built-in damage reduction, she doesn't need as many resistances. So Annie, she gets a shield, so that's why you want stuff like Gargoyle Stoneplate on her. Building health on Annie doesn't help her as much as resistances because when she has her shield up, health does nothing, only resistances do. So that's why she prefers the Gargoyle Stoneplate over the Redemption, for example. Warmogs is still decent on her though, because like it's just a generic good tank item, and especially since she's the low-cost unit, she might not have like the most health in the game. Onto the next units, we have the AD melee carries, Camille and Yasuo. Camille, again, she can do a lot of different builds too. She can do like a full tank build, very similar to the Fiora, just go full sustain and like build her that way. Or she has the damage crit build. So Titan's Resolve plus 2 tank items work, or Titan's Resolve plus 2 damage items. I like the IE Hand of Justice combo because it gives her a little bit of healing and it just does a lot of damage together. After that, we have Yasuo. Yasuo, he is going to be one of the premier AD melee carries of the set, so you need Edge of Night or Quicksilver on him. You may be asking, what games do you want Quicksilver? What games do you want Edge of Night? Well, if your champion needs to stack, such as like a duelist, then you're going to prefer the Quicksilver. However, you may notice already, Yasuo is a duelist. Why do I have Edge of Night on him? Yasuo relies more on his spell to do damage than his auto attack, so that's why I prefer Edge of Night on him instead. On the other hand, if you run something more like Rage Blade reliant, then I kind of prefer the QSS on them. I think Edge of Night is a slightly better item than Quicksilver right now, so when it's like a close toss-up, I would lean towards more the Edge of Night for now. And again, that's going to be on this patch. If they change and buff Quicksilver in the future, or they nerf Edge of Night, then obviously that's going to change. And that's why I like explaining why each unit uses which item, because then when things change in the future, you'll know how to switch out your builds. Healing and then just a stacking item with Titan's Resolve will just finish him off right there. But a lot of different things can work on Yasuo. I've seen like Jeweled Gauntlet work, full AP builds, lots of different things like that. Onto the AP carries. So we have Yuumi. Yuumi, great support unit, so you want to put stuff like Chalice on her. Great to buff up your AP carries. You could put Shroud on her. A lot of different things you could do. But if you do want to play like a carry Yuumi, it's just blue buff plus AP items. Ezreal, pretty useless, so he's never going to be your carry. And he's a great support unit though, because he chills enemy units. So if you're facing like an enemy Zed or something like that, Ezreal can chill him and lower his attack speed. So you want him to cast as often as possible, so that's why I like mana items on him. However, I will say you don't like need to itemize Ezreal. You could just use him similar to the Jinx and Yuumi we have here, just throw all the support items on him. Static Shiv to kind of reduce magic resistance. Chalice and Zeke's to buff up your adjacent carries. That's going to be like Ezreal's bread and butter, same for Jinx. So all these 3 units, Sivir included as well, they're just all really good support units. And Again, when you're a 2-cost unit, you're not going to be the primary carry most cases. Like, we only had maybe like Yasuo is really the only main 2-star reroll, and sorry, Draven as well. But apart from that, for like these guys, like they're mainly on support duty because they have good traits, so they can be used in a lot of late game boards, and their carry potential is a little less than some of the 1-cost or like the 3-cost rerolls we're about to get into. Draven, last one up, he is the only range AD carry from the 2-cost. I guess Sivir is too, sorry about that. But Sivir's kind of like, she heals her team as well, so that's why she's kind of in the middle there. But Draven, since he's going to be a Mecha Prime, I like having Bloodthirster on him to have some sort of sustain, just because he's going to be your last man standing a lot of cases. Last Whisper, he does only attack damage, so Last Whisper is going to make a lot of sense. He's probably going to kill a bunch of tanks. And then IE, just like a solid damage item, and it works with a critical strike chance you get from the Last Whisper. So just all in all, pretty decent complementary items right there. Now let's go over the 3-cost units. So 3-cost is where it gets a little more interesting because some of these can be 3-starred, and obviously those are super strong. They can carry you into the late game. That's like your capped board, but some of them, they're hard stuck at 2-star. So it's going to depend a little bit on that situation, but let's start up again with the tanks. So Alistar, just a pure tank unit. He benefits a lot from health. His ability heals based on how much his max health is. His ability heals himself and the lowest health ally for 20% of his maximum health. That's why we're stacking the Warmogs on him. It is super important to have that stat on him. And then Redemption, it just complements Warmogs a lot. Protector's Vow kind of does the same job, but more for resistances. After that, we have Rammus. So Rammus is a bit of a weird situation. I see people build him, and they're building like Dragon Claw on him because their logic is, hey, Rammus gets a lot of armor. Let's build some health and magic resist to get a lot more effective HP. And while that logic does sound pretty good, the only reason why you want to play Rammus is because you're facing a lot of attack damage teams. So you don't really need that much magic resist, if at all, on Rammus. Because if you did need like a more balanced tank, you'd play someone else instead, such as Zac, for example. So with that in mind, we're going to just stack health and more armor on Rammus, and then we'll have something like a Protector's Vow to boost up his resistances a little more. It gives both armor and MR, but it's kind of like a half and half item. But the most important thing that Protector's Vow gives is starting bonus mana. And Rammus, he jumps at the largest group of nearby enemies, and then he knocks them up and stuns them. So the earlier he does this, the better. That's why Protector's Vow is mainly built on him. It's just to get his first cast off that much faster. And we all know the earlier something happens in a fight, the better it is. After that, we have Cho'Gath. So Cho'Gath is similar to Rammus. You only play him if you're facing a lot of magic damage. However, you may notice already, we have a Bramble Vest on him. So you're saying right now, like, hey, why would I even play him if I need to build armor on him because I only want to play against magic damage dealers as Cho'Gath? So I should have like Warmog's double Dragon Claw or something like that. Well, you may be thinking that, but a lot of the magic damage in this set uses Jeweled Gauntlet. So that's the only reason why we have Bramble Vest. It reduces 75% of critical strike damage. And if everyone's building Jeweled Gauntlet, like, I mean, you just need Bramble Vest against that because it reduces the damage by a ton. And then in those weird situations where you are facing other stuff that does have some physical damage, because everyone auto attacks, right? It helps a tiny bit there too. But the main reason why you get it is to reduce critical strike damage. Other than that, Warmogs for health, Dragon Claw for magic resist. His ability actually scales off of how much magic resist you have, so good and dandy to get that in there. After that, we have Nyla, a bit more of a standard tank, but she's still a little bit weird. So I like using her in compositions which have a lot of other different tanks because she heals your team, and it's actually quite a big heal. So I just like having standard tank items on her with a tiny bit of scaling AP with the Titan's Resolve just to give her a little bit more umph in her heal. She does a tiny bit of damage too, but I just like throwing a Warmogs on her plus the Sunfire Cape. Warmogs is just the most popular tank item, and the reason why is because most health stacking buffs, they're either percent health, such as like Alistar's or like Brawlers, or tank traits give armor or magic resistance, so it just gives a lot of bonuses there. Obviously, Nyla has none of those, but it's still like a decent item to have on her because most people are building this in the early game anyways. After that, we have Riven. Riven's she could kind of go all over the place. So Riven's one of those types of champions where she needs every single stat. She does a bit of damage. She has a shield, so when you have a shield, you like resistances more than health. But if she has more health than her target, she deals bonus damage. So if you want to stack health on her to guarantee the bonus damage, that's one way to build her. If you want to stack resistances to make her shield a little bit more effective, that's valid argument as well. If you want to build some damage on her, such as like Ionic Spark, Titan's Resolve, like there's justification for that too. So my logic when it comes to approaching Riven, instead of building like all sorts of different stuff, because she needs like 10 different things to work, you could build like none of those and just go for like Sunfire Cape and Ionic Spark instead to kind of support your team more. And they're like also just decent tank items. And when you play Riven, you're most likely playing Misfortune, so that's why the Ionic Spark is good as well. I still like having the Warmogs on her because getting the bonus damage is pretty good, especially at 3-star, but if you do reach 3-star, maybe you want something like a Redemption to give her a little bit of sustain. Jax is the only melee carry of the 3-cost units, so he's a bit alone here, and notice how I said before, Edge of Night versus Quicksilver? The units that like Rageblade, they love Quicksilver so that they could keep stacking it throughout the early parts of the fight, because if you stack in the early part of the fight, you'll be able to snowball the stacks and get like a ton of attack speed later on. You want some sustain on Jax as well, so either get it from an augment or from a Bloodthirster. So if you have Celestial Blessing 2 or 3, you don't need the Bloodthirster. You could go like a 3rd damage item instead, but if you don't have that, you definitely want the Bloodthirster. But I'd say Quicksilver and Rageblade are my 2 favorite items on Jax at least. After that, let's get into the bottom right. We have the AP carry, so Vel'Koz. Vel'Koz is a support unit. He stuns the highest damage dealer on the enemy team, so we want him to cast as often as possible. So Spear of Shojin, gonna do exactly just that. Static Shiv, gonna help him cast faster, and it kind of is a support item for your team. Chalice of Harmony, more support for your team as well. LeBlanc, she's gonna be a carry. She's a hacker, spellslinger, and admin, so it's gonna depend on what the admin trait on what you build a tiny bit, but overall, just full AP works on her. Archangels, Jeweled Gauntlet, Giant Slayer to kill the tanks is really helpful because she's often going to target those people first. And once she gets her first kill, she gets her next kill because she's a reset champion, so you need more kills on her to really get her going. And then since she has like a mini reset, I personally don't like blue buff on her, but some people build blue buff on her anyways. It's probably very similar power level to just having like another Archangels, for example, or another hat. So for LeBlanc, I'd say like most things, almost anything goes. Sona, she's like a very strong support unit. You could build her damage and go like blue buff full AP. I've done it before, and if you get her 3-star, it's decent, but mainly you're going to be using her as a 2-star, so if you really want to itemize her, throw a blue buff on her. That's probably the best item for her by far. If not, just put support items such as Chalice on her to buff up your other spell slingers or your other heart units. Zoe is in a weird case. She is probably the best Morello user of the set, and blue buff Morello, gonna be fantastic on her. You could also, I guess, run like Morello on Cho'Gath, now that I think about it, because he hits quite a few units anyway. So if you want to build it on a tank, remember how we put Morello Namicon on a Hecarim in the last set? Cho'Gath can kind of do that too. But yeah, Zoe, great user of that item. Blue buff gets her to cast very, very often. And then Static Shiv, since she does a lot of damage over time, Static Shiv is good at whittling other people down and kind of help her damage really tick a lot faster because they have less magic resistance. So it's like a decent item on her. You could put the Static Shiv on a support unit such as Vel'Koz, and if you play like Vel'Koz and Zoe on the same team, for example. I'm not saying you should, but I'm just saying anyone can hold the Static Shiv, but it's pretty good on her because she deals damage like over time to a bunch of different people. If you don't want the Static Shiv, you could go like Hextech Gunblade, Rabadon's Death Cap, any sort of AP item will do. Giant Slayer also works. Next up, we have Kai'Sa. She is both an attack speed and an ability power carry. So she's kind of the hybrid between the two. That's why she's in the center here. And I have this interesting item build on her. A lot of people like Rageblade on Kai'Sa. The reason why is because she gets a stacking attack speed bonus. So if you do a Static Shiv build on her, which probably is the best thing to do right now, you end up getting a lot of stacks. But I'm here to argue that Rapid Fire Cannon is better than Rageblade, because Rapid Fire Cannon, it gives you 50% attack speed right as a fight starts. Rageblade, it gives you 10% attack speed, and then you get 5% more attack speed after every auto attack. So it takes you 8 auto attacks to equal the Rapid Fire Cannon. However, Kai'Sa's ability says that Kai'Sa gains bonus attack speed for 10 seconds, and this bonus can stack. And at 1-star, that's 40%, at 2-star, that's 50%, and at 3-star, that's 65%. So the RFC gets her to her first stack from her ability faster than the Rageblade. And then from that, that's how you get perma-stacking throughout the fight. You could also argue that the faster damage from the Rapid Fire Cannon also helps out in a fight a little bit more, because damage at the start of the fight means more than damage at the end of the fight if you kill units early. That's why we like having the Protector's Vow on Rammus, so that he casts faster to get a stun off earlier. And that's pretty much like my interesting item build for Kaisa. Let's see if it actually takes off, because I think it is better than Rageblade. Giant Slayer is going to be the third item, just because she's focusing a lot of tanks pretty often, but this honestly could be any sort of damage item. It could be like Archangels, it could be Rabadons, it could be a healing item such as Hand of Justice, it could be Guard Breaker, it literally could be anything. After that, let's look at Senna. Senna's an AD carry, and typically she's going to be either a support unit building Zeke's Herald, or if you 3-star her, you could do this damage build that you see here. So she doesn't get much attack speed from anywhere, that's why she likes the Rageblade. Infinity Edge is good to buff up the AD that she gets from the Sure Shot trait, and then Giant Slayer just a pretty good damage item in general for the late game. After that, we have Vayne. She gets Recon and Duelist, so she gets attack speed and critical strike built into her kit. So to complement that, we just need as much damage as possible, like flat damage, because she already has all the multipliers built in. And she also has true damage in her ability, so you don't need stuff like Last Whisper. Not saying Last Whisper is bad, but you just don't need it compared to other attack damage champions. So with that in mind, Deathblade gives the most AD, Giant Slayer, just a great damage amp as well against large targets, and then Infinity Edge is going to buff up the Recon critical strike and activate it on her ability as well. So that's exactly what you want there. Let's hop on over into the tier 4 items now. So this one's a little weird because some of the item combinations on these, like, you won't see in a guide because some of the items are a little unrealistic. But if you had to ask me like what I would actually build best in slot for sure, it'd be something like this. Of course, I'll still tell you which ones to try to go for. But like for Zac, you read Zac, right? When he dies, he gets a bunch of blobs and their health is based off of his max health. So Warmogs is the only option there. If you get a lot of resistances on him, the blobs aren't going to get any of that. So that's why you want like triple Warmogs on Zac. But that's not going to happen in most games. So if you can't get that, what do you want? At least double Warmogs, if not like a Sunfire Cape, which gives a lot of bonus health as well, or a Redemption to complement the Warmogs before he actually dies. That's probably what I'd build on Zac. Sejuani, we're back to more normal stuff here. So she's a brawler, so Warmogs is really good on her too, because she gets more bonus % health. And then Protector's Vow, you really want Sejuani to cast early, right? So that just gives her a lot of bonus mana. And then Redemption, just great complementary item to units with a lot of health. Honorable mention for Morello Namicon, she is a user of it, so if you do need anti-heal on your team, she's a great holder for it as well. Second honorable mention is ZZ Rot Portal. So it may not make that much sense because if you have like a good tank, you generally don't want to build ZZ Rots on them. But you want Sejuani to cast earlier. So ZZ Rot taunts people around in a radius, and that causes her to get focus, which is a good thing because that means she gets mana faster so that she could cast faster. So it's kind of like a weird way to get her to cast faster if you don't have Protector's Vow. Echo, he's another normal main tank. I like Sunfire Cape on him a lot because he dashes into the enemy team, so you could often get an anti-heal on like their carry. So if you manage to hit them with the AoE ability, so Echo is a Star Guardian, so you most likely are running like Talia carry, which can throw walls to the back line. He could put an anti-heal on their carry, and then Talia bops them, and then you get a nice kill there. That's why I like Sunfire Cape on Echo a lot. Other than that, just regular tank items. He also likes casting early, similar to Sejuani, so that's why I have the Protector's Vow on him as well. Set, he is going to be most likely in a Mecha Prime build, so you don't need the Warmogs on him because he gets a lot of health from just being a Mecha Prime. What do you want instead then? Well, Redemption's still going to help out pretty well. Dragonclaw going to give him a lot of healing and resistances, and then Bramble Vest, of course, resistances and prevents critical strike damage. So you're going to be building Set a little bit different from the other tanks if he is your Mecha Prime. If he is not a Mecha Prime, you just build him like how you see these other characters. After that, let's move on into the melee carries. Quite a few of them here. We have Viego, Belveth, and Zed. Let's start with Viego. So I don't argue with like the science, right? For some reason, whenever you build Ionic Spark on Viego, he just magically comes alive. I'm not saying you can't win without an Ionic Spark, but whenever he has it, he just pops off so much harder. So you're just going to have to build that every game on him until something changes. And then after that, I like the Jeweled Gauntlet Hand of Justice combo. It gives him a much needed heal, and Hand of Justice gives critical strike chance for his Jeweled Gauntlet. So Jeweled Gauntlet is good because when he gets a kill, he gets a reset and he gets a cast again. Jeweled Gauntlet increases that chance because sometimes you get kills you normally wouldn't get if it did not crit. That's why I like this build on Viego. Some people like going Archangels, the more like consistent, less surprising, less bursty build, and then focus more on late game. But both builds have their merits. I just like this one more because you get unexpected resets. After that, we have Belveth. So Belveth likes the Edge and Knight a lot. I've seen like RFC Belveth, but I like Edge and Knight more for survivability. Last Whisper, she does attack damage, and then Giant Slayer, just a really good damage amplifier, so that's why I like having that there. And then I don't build that much attack speed on Belveth, like rapid fire cannon or anything like that, because she naturally has a built-in attack speed ramp in her kit. After that, we have Zed. So his build's a little interesting. He has double Runons. The reason why is because he does a lot of AoE. So whenever you have an AoE attack damage champion, you generally like building Runons on them because it makes more use of their AoE damage by actually killing those units instead of leaving them at 1 HP. So that's why I like the double Runons on him. If you can't get double Runons, IE works, Deathblade works, Last Whisper works, any generic attack damage item, Giant Slayer works, is gonna be perfect for him. For survivability, I like Edge of Night because you don't need an healing item on Zed. Why do you ask? Well, he's got Hacker, so the Hacker trait gives him Omnivamp, so you don't need to itemize for it and just go pure damage instead. Onto the next group, we have the AP carries. We have Talia, Soraka, Aurelion Sol, and MF. Interesting builds here. So Talia, more straightforward. She just gets a Spear of Shojin. She gets bonus mana from the Star Guardian trait. So I've seen both Shojin and blue buff work well on Talia, but I think Shojin's a little bit better. Jeweled Gauntlet to get the surprise kills, and then Giant Slayer, well, you need to kill tanks at the end of the day. It's hard to kill tanks as an AP carry, so that's why you generally build it on them, and it's just a good item in the late game anyways. Not too much to explain here, it's just generic AP items on Talia, similar to every other set we played of in TFT. Soraka, she really likes the blue buff because she likes casting a ton, and she's got a low mana pool. So every third cast, she has like bonus stars that come down. So you want to cast as much as possible. So if you're not building blue buff on Soraka, you're trolling. After that, literally, she can use any AP item. It really doesn't matter. I've even seen like static Shiv Soraka. Like literally after the blue buff, she could even have like 2 Chalice of Powers and she'll be fine if she's supporting someone else on her team. But you really just need the blue buff and then any other 2 items will do. Aurelion Sol, this is where it gets interesting. Both Asol and MF, you notice their builds. They have a lot of mana built into it. So Asol, he really wants to cast as soon as possible. So he applies a Morellonomicon naturally in his kit. So he burns the enemy team. So you just need him to cast ASAP. So to do that, Spear of Shojin and blue buff. Blue buff for the accelerated starting mana, Spear of Shojin for the subsequent cast. That's really going to be the bread and butter of Aurelion Sol. And then I like Hat a lot more than Archangels because Archangels, it deals a lot of damage at the end of the fight. But since I rely more on Asol with his burns, that's why I like the Hat a little bit more than the Archangels because it gives his first cast a little more oomph. After that, we have Misfortune. Misfortune, she loves casting and it takes her forever to cast. So she is probably the only person you'll want to build double Spear of Shojin on because there's diminishing returns to Spear of Shojin. And she's probably one of the only champions to make it work, and it's just because she just takes so goddamn long to cast. After that, Giant Slayer is a really good damage item on her because she focuses the tanks a lot, so you need to blow past the tanks before you hit the DPSs in the back, so that's why I like having Giant Slayer on her. Contrast that with Aurelion Sol, where he's hitting everyone. He doesn't need the Giant Slayer because he can bypass them. After that, we have Samira. So Samira, she has an AoE ability similar to Zed. When she casts her ability, she bounces a bullet and it does like a bunch of AoE damage. So again, that's why I like the Runons on her. Last Whisper because she mainly does attack damage. And then IE to complement the crit and allows her ability to crit as well. And it just overall works pretty well. If she has Sure Shot, she doesn't need that trait, but it definitely does help out. That gives her a lot of bonus AD, so that's why you don't really need to build Deathblade on her. Finally, we have the tier 5 champions. By the way, if you guys want to check this site out on your own to like reference, just go to anywhere on bunnymuffins.lol and then it's on this item thing up here and a bunch of other useful stuff here as well. So definitely check that out when you have the time. But back down to the 5 costs, we have at the top Leona. She is a little weird. So I've been conflicted with her. Normally tanks have some sort of tanking ability, but hers just does damage. However, since it's a max health reduction per second, you could still build her tanky. And also she is an Aegis, so she still gets some tanky traits. I'd say she's just a little awkward to build, that is all. At first, I thought she would be primarily used as a damage carry, similar to how Mordekaiser is used, but I've seen more success on her as a tank, so that's why we're just gonna do the generic tank items. Warmog's Declaw, you could do Bramble Vest, Stone Plate, but I throw in the Titan's Resolve just to boost up her damage just a tiny little bit. After that, we have Nunu. He's a bit of a weird situation as well because he runs around the map. The whole question comes down to Morello or Sunfire Cape. Honestly, at the end of the day, it probably won't matter, but I think Sunfire Cape is slightly better because I feel like sometimes he misses people with his Morello because he's just walking around the map randomly. That the Sunfire Cape definitely hits a couple more units, but it's not going to happen in every case. Some cases, Morello is going to be better as well. It depends how the enemy team is positioning against you. After that, Ionic Spark's pretty good because he's like in the enemy lines. They cast a bunch and it buffs up your team a bit. And then Hextech Gunblade, it helps him towards the end of the fight if he lives there to just heal massive amounts because he's dealing massive amounts of damage anyways. He essentially has a built-in Archangel staff, so you don't really need to build your own. After that, we have Fiddlesticks. Fiddlesticks, if you're not building Archangels on him, I feel like it's trolling because he doesn't activate right away. So since he doesn't activate right away, he has time to build up at least a couple of stacks before he jumps out into the enemy team and surprise parties them. Of course, since he hits a group of people, Morello is going to be really good, similar to Swain in last set if you guys played that one. And then Ionic Spark going to be buffing up his damage and your team's damage as well because, again, he's jumping into the enemy team. Anytime you have someone jump into the enemy team, such as like Echo, Fiddlesticks, Nunu, stuff like Ionic Spark and Sunfire are going to have like a tiny bit more value. That's why we build it on those champions. Mordekaiser, he just likes flat AP. Some people like Archangels, some people like Jeweled Gauntlet on him, but here's my argument for Double Hat. He is going to kill people no matter what items he has. So doing stuff like Jeweled Gauntlet, doing stuff like Archangel Staff, it overkills them. So you just need the hats and then some sustain from the Hextech Gunblade. And I think you could just call it a day for Mordekaiser after that. Like, he overkills so much that, like, yeah, the extra AP that you would get from a scaling Archangels or like the critical strike chance from Jeweled Gauntlet is just unnecessary. It might help you kill like a Mecha Prime, but he'll do fine without it in like most other scenarios, trust me. After that, let's go to Syndra. She's kind of the only AP carry this set as a legendary that's ranged, but she's not really. I just like building support items on her. Spira Shojin is important to get her to cast faster because that's really all you care about on Syndra, having her cast a bunch. And then after that, Chalice to buff up teammates, Zeke's to buff up teammates, Static Shiv to lower their magic resistance. Same story on Janna, just like all support items minus the Shojin. I feel like you could do full support items on Janna, and you're going to be good to go from there. Urgot is a little weird. So some items don't work on Urgot. And it's really, really weird. I found it's best not to itemize Urgot and to itemize the other people instead because the scaling's really odd. So if you build AP on him, you get more loot. So I guess if you have a really strong team and you add in a random Urgot, sure, put ability power on him so that you farm more items for your team. If you need him to deal damage, attack damage is going to work much better on him. I personally like Runons because he does a tiny bit of AoE, and I feel like Runons just complements that a little bit. But really just, you could throw either any item on him or no items on him. That's really all there is to it for Urgot. I just would prefer itemizing other legendaries instead. Next up, we have Aphelios. He is the premier AD carry of the set, and he is a 5 cost. And since he has a bunch of AoE abilities, I like the Runons. Since he's attack damage only, I like Last Whisper. And then since he is just in the late game as your carry, Giant Slayer is going to do really well. I don't know if you guys have noticed a pattern yet. I think in the 5 and 4 cost carries, we used a lot more Giant Slayers than in the 1 and 2 cost carries. The reason why is because the 1 and 2 costs, they deal more with winning the early and mid game. So people don't have that much health, and you get a top 4 with a 1 cost reroll, you're pretty happy. 3 cost is when you start liking the Giant Slayer, because when you itemize for a 3-star 3 cost, you're generally going to hit that really late into the game. It's like kind of comparable to a 2-star legendary in a way. And that's why you build the Giant Slayer on them, because you're hitting your power spike later on in the game, and then Giant Slayer is going to be slightly better in those situations. 4 costs, obviously, those are going to be in like your stage 4, stage 5, and beyond carries. And then for the legendaries, Giant Slayer is obviously going to be really good on champions that need it. Aphelios is the only pure damage champion, so he'll definitely use it. And Mordekaiser, he already 1-taps everyone, so he doesn't need Giant Slayer. The whole story with Mordekaiser is to kill a tank, he has to cast twice anyways. So like the Giant Slayer, it's not going to change your timings compared to like a Rabadon's Death Cap. Maybe he has to cast 3 times to kill like a Mecha Prime or something. But that's kind of the long story short for itemization in this set. Do let me know if you have questions or maybe you have like suggestions or changes. Obviously, I couldn't cover every item on every champion because a lot more items work on these. I just like these the most. And of course, in your games, you just have to slam whatever you get. A lot of skill in TFT is just knowing which items aren't horrible versus which items are best in slot. Like that's kind of the trade-off sometimes you make in a game like this where you get random items. But again, like all this is found on my website, bunnymuffins.lol. We also have a bunch of other good stuff there, such as a tier list, leveling guide, coaching, things like that, and all my social media pages if you want to check that out too. I just realized this says set 7.5. I need to change that to 8. But that's going to be it from me today. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that, and I hope to see you guys next time.